Dober večer, lep pozdrav v galeriji Jakobič. Od tu naprej bomo nocoj seveda govorili angleško zaradi našega gosta. So good evening and please welcome Mr. Victor Burgin with us. I actually could say that in last 10 years, since I am running this gallery, this is one of the peaks of our program. It is a lecture which we are really looking forward, a talk which will present one of the most renowned theoreticians and of course also artists in the field of photography. I am very pleased to say that this is already the third edition of our cooperation with Membrana. The Photography on Sofa, so-called, is a program which we are running now for years already, and we are extremely happy to have this event here, and we even have a new sofa this year, so it means we mean seriously with this series of events each year. Let me shortly introduce my guests today, which are actually the guests of each other as well. But firstly, over the past 30 years, Victor Burgin's work has established him as both a highly influential artist and renowned theorist of still and moving image. He was born in Sheffield, England, and currently lives and works in Paris and Gascony in France. He graduated from the School of Painting at the Royal College of Art in London and then studied philosophy and fine art at Yale University. As a professor, he has been lecturing at several American and European universities. Victor Burgin gained prominence in the late 1960s as a conceptual artist, noted at the time as a political photographer of the left, and was later nominated for the Turner Prize in 1986. His interest in both concept and material has led to a unique and innovative approach to photography, manifested through photo text works, prints, digital video, and 3D modeling. In the 1970s, he began focusing on the interplay between images and text, turning to digital means in the 1990s to further extend his investigations into politics, philosophy, and psychoanalysis. As he himself would put it, he exhibits his work regularly at the solo and group exhibitions worldwide. His work is included in the collections of MoMA, the Tate, the Walker Art Center, the British Council Art Collection, among others. In terms of his theoretical work in the field of photography, he has produced a number of books that anthologize his influential essays and interviews, among which Thinking Photography, that he edited in 1982, is probably the best known. But there are many more. Some of those and the ones which have been translated also in this new Slovenian edition of selected works, which we will later present in his talk in our show. Also, Jan Babnik, the editor of Membrana and Revija Fotografija, will lead this conversation tonight between Mr. Burgin and our second guest, Ilija Tomanić-Tribunja, a professor at the Department of Media Studies and Communication at the Faculty of Social Science here in Ljubljana, who is as well a co-editor of Membrana and has contributed a preface to this special edition of Membrana magazine. Mr. Burgin, Ilija, Jan, it is a great pleasure to have you all here at this event. Welcome, and now please, Mr. Burgin, we are looking forward to your presentation, which will firstly present your artistic work and then later on to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this mic working okay? Can you hear me? Okay. If you couldn't hear me, then you couldn't answer that question, I guess. I came to photography from a background in art at a time in the late 1960s when the art world considered the expression art photography to be an oxymoron. What drew me to photography was neither its aesthetic nor its documentary status, but rather the place it occupies in everyday life. In conjunction with writing, in newspapers, magazines, advertising, family photographs, and so on, photography played, as it still plays, a fundamental role in the formation of the ideas, beliefs, and values according to which people live. To use photography in my works for art galleries and museums therefore allowed me to bring my visual art practice into dialogue with a significant aspect of the broader environment of representations into which it was produced. It allowed me to think critically about representational forms beyond the confines of art. I would emphasize representational forms. When I speak of bringing my art practice into dialogue with the everyday environment of representations, I do not mean to say that my works necessarily aim to represent the contents of that environment, but rather that they are, as it were, as we say in English, cut from the same cloth as the technological and symbolic forms of everyday media representations. The fabric of this environment today is substantively different from what it was when I first turned to photography in the 1960s. As much as it is an environment of photographic representations, it is now an environment of digital simulations. It's on this aspect of photography that I'll focus my remarks this evening. I shall set the stage for my remarks by first showing the work that was the occasion for my own first introduction to the virtual camera. For many years, most of my work originated in invitations to respond to a city or to a place, a building. When I was invited to Istanbul in the context of Istanbul 2010, cultural capital of Europe, I found that the building I had chosen to work with could no longer be photographed. The Taschlik Coffee House and Garden, constructed between 1947 and 1948, had been dismantled in 1988 to make way for a large luxury hotel. The architect of the coffee house, Sedat Haki Eldam, had designed a modestly elegant building on a splendid site overlooking the Bosphorus, which synthesized a 17th century Ottoman architectural vocabulary with that of 20th century modernism. Eldam, in fact, had studied in Paris with Le Corbusier before returning to Istanbul. I chose this building as the basis for my work for two reasons. First, it succinctly articulated the Ataturk Republican ideal of the modern and democratic expression of a historically rooted Turkish national identity. Always trying to grab attention. And secondly, my reason for choosing this building to work with, the destruction of Istanbul's heritage of fine public architecture in the interests of private profit seemed to me to be an urgent political issue. And of course, as we all know, in May 2013, 3 years later, a no less brutal development plan for Gezi Park by Taksim Square sparked massive anti-government protests. When the Swiss Hotel was built in 1988, the Taschlik Coffee House was dismantled and part of it re-erected in a different position to be used as an Orientalist tourist restaurant. The former garden was turned into a car park, and where there was once a view of the Bosphorus, there is now a view of a rooftop tennis court, replete with advertisements for mobile phones. Rather than give up the idea of working with the building, I decided to abandon the physical camera in favor of the virtual. My project became one of reconstructing the coffee house in the virtual space of a computer model, to disinter the utopian imaginary of the Tashlik Kahve as it was at the time it was built. As befits a project of excavation, the completed work was shown in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. So as I said, that was a work I made in 2010. And it was the work that introduced me to the virtual camera. That's when I stopped using a conventional camera and started using computer cameras in virtual space. In both its mode of production, 3D computer modeling, and in its content, the theme of a parallel virtual world, the work, A Place to Read, inherits a long history. The desire to construct a world of representations that faithfully reproduces the world of material reality is a salient feature of Western history since at least the early modern period. In 1973, Roland Barthes wrote, "There will always be representation, for so long as a subject, author, reader, spectator, or voyeur casts his gaze towards a horizon on which he cuts out the base of a triangle, his eye or his mind forming the apex." Although based on natural phenomena, the physics of light, and the physiology and psychology of visual perception, the perspectival system of representation is not in itself natural, nor, as the pictorial traditions of Islam and such civilizations as those of Egypt and China demonstrate, is it inevitable. Nevertheless, it has come to universally frame hegemonic representations of the world. Perspectival representation now passes as quasi-natural and is largely unremarked as a system. In a 17th century engraving, a small hole pierced in the wall of a large building-like structure transmits the inverted image of the building it faces upon an interior wall. The action is in fact reciprocal. Each of the two structures receives the image of the other. All buildings are in principle camera obscuras. For the most part, the apertures formed by their windows are too large to produce an image in focus, and their rooms insufficiently dark for the images to be visible to the eye. Nevertheless, a city is a de facto conglomeration of cameras, their interior walls blindly registering evanescent projections from their exteriors. A widely reproduced picture of an urban space hangs in the National Gallery of the Marche in Urbino, Italy. The work dates from about 1480 and shows a city square flanked by palazzi and large bourgeois houses. Two closely similar paintings, originating in Urbino and apparently by the same hand, today hang in museums in Berlin and Baltimore. The authorship of the trio of painted panels, now collectively known as the Ideal City, is uncertain. Just as the authorship of the pictures is indeterminate, so is their purpose. It is not known whether the images were intended as paintings in their own right, whether they should be understood as illustrations of an architectural thesis, or whether they are designs for theatrical scenery. This is the Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza. We can leave the resolution of such questions to art historians, but the fact that they've been raised may remind us that the organization of pictorial space, the origin of the rational city plan, and the scenographic conventions of the Western stage are inseparably intertwined in the Renaissance project of perspectival representation that gave us the modern camera. In the 19th century, photography replaced perspective drawing as the principal mode of pictorial representation of reality. Photography was consistent with the fundamental impulse of the Industrial Revolution, the delegation of previously time-consuming and skilled manual tasks to the automatic operation of machines. In the late 20th century, the technology of the camera obscura underwent a second revolution with the advent of the computer, where photography represents a shift from manual to mechanical execution. Computer imaging effects a shift from mechanical to electronic execution. Manual perspective drawing with optical aids gives way to the mechanical operation of the machine, which then cedes place to electronic computation. The emergence of the camera in the virtual space brought about by the digital revolution has revealed the essence of the camera to be immaterial, residing in optical, geometrical, and mathematical principles, so independent of their physical and now computational forms. The computer modeling programs I use today render space in terms of a representational system that originated in Italy around 1420, when Filippo Brunelleschi applied principles of optics and geometry to painting. To consider the camera in terms of the history of perspective, therefore, suggests a periodization in which we may speak of pre-modern, industrial, and digital photography. The shift across this history is both quantitative and qualitative. An increased amount of information is deployed in the interests of a higher degree of mimetic realism. However, where photography represents an aspect of the object in front of the camera, the computer may in principle simulate the object in its entirety. The principles of computer simulation are nevertheless continuous with the prior pre-digital history of photography. This belonged to Oliver Wendell Holmes. Photogrammetry, the derivation of metrical attributes of three-dimensional objects from photographs, is as old as photography itself. Photogrammetry software combines multiple photographs of an object or scene taken from different angles to produce a photorealistic 3D computer model. Once used mainly for land surveying, the technique has since been adopted by filmmakers and more recently by video game developers. The application of electronic computation to principles of optics and projective geometry known since classical antiquity now allows a variety of types of computer models to be derived from conventional camera images. In 2008, researchers made the first 3D simulations of the built environment to be constructed from crowdsourced images found on the internet. Rome was not built in a day, but in 2008, 500 computers working in parallel upon some 60,000 images from the photo-sharing website Flickr constructed a model of the entire city of Dubrovnik in 22 hours. Most photogrammetric computer simulations comprise two basic components: either a wireframe or point cloud reconstruction of the underlying geometry of the object, and a surface, simply shaded, or in this case photorealistic, applied over this geometry. The basis of photogrammetry is a principle that for most of the 20th century was considered only as a passing amusement in the prehistory of photography, the stereoscope. In fact, I haven't looked at a recent history of photography book, but I've got several old ones, the classic Beaumont Newhall, all of those. I have those on my shelf. And they always begin with a chapter where they show the prehistory of photography, and they show the stereoscope as this kind of parlor amusement something inconsequential. Today, it's the basis of photographic innovation. A prescient account of the potential of stereoscopic photography was published in the mid-19th century by the American physician Oliver Wendell Holmes. In an essay of 1859, Holmes writes, I quote, "Form is henceforth divorced from matter. In fact, matter, as a visible object, is of no great use any longer, except as the mold on which form is shaped. Give us a few negatives of a thing worth seeing, taken from different points of view, and that is all we want of it. Men will soon hunt all objects as they hunt the cattle in South America for their skins and leave the carcasses as of little worth." 1859 is amazing. He just described what's happening now. I was told if I gave a lecture in Ljubljana, I had to get a dragon in there somewhere. The system of artificial perspective that emerged in the West in the early 15th century was derived mainly from an Italian translation of a treatise on optics by the Arab mathematician known as Alhazen. It's from Alhazen's Book of Optics that the idea of the cone of vision is derived. What is immediately striking about diagrammatic representations of the cone of vision in the treatises on perspective that ensued is that the cone or pyramid of light rays by which the object is revealed appears to emanate from the eye of the observer. The pre-Socratic philosopher Democritus held that all material things emit images of themselves, whereas both Plato and Euclid advanced an extramission theory of vision, according to which light is emitted by the eye. Setting aside questions of physiology and optical physics, questions which now have long been resolved, we may accept that to geometry and geometric algebra, it is a matter of indifference in which direction light rays travel between object and observer. This indifference is foundational to such familiar technologies as Google Street View, only one of a growing number of applications in which the photograph not only receives light from the world, but in effect emits light to replicate the real world in the virtual. The most recent iteration of the technology used by Google Street View determines the 3D geometry of the buildings it records by projecting laser light onto them and deriving measurements from their reflections. It then clothes the wireframe model that results by means of conventional panoramic photography. In the incomplete last chapter of his final book, The Visible and the Invisible, 1964, Maurice Merleau-Ponty reminds us that to see is also, I quote, to be seen by the outside, to exist within it, to emigrate into it, to be seduced, captivated, alienated by the phantom, so that we no longer know which sees and which is seen. In computer space, the camera again becomes what it was in the earliest days of cinema, when camera and projector were often the same instrument. In the dialectic of the giving and taking of light, the universal appropriation of the lived environment by the camera is accompanied by the omnipresent threat of total surveillance. This street light in a public square in Turin, which I photographed a couple of weeks ago, brings together lighting elements and surveillance cameras. A character in the British writer Lewis Carroll's 1895 story, Sylvia and Bruno Concluded, speaks of a country for which a map has been made, I quote, on the scale of a mile to the mile. When asked if the map has been much used, he's told, "It has never been spread out. The farmers objected. They said it would cover the whole country and shut out the sunlight." Our various camera mappings of the world do not shut out the light. They are formed in the light and transparently permeate our everyday reality. I began by remarking on the obvious fact that the everyday media environment today is increasingly an environment of digital simulations. I can no longer be certain if what I see in a photograph or a film is a representation of something in the real world or a computer simulation clothed in the familiar attributes of a photograph. Following the automation of perspective drawing through photography, the animation of the photographic image with the advent of cinema inaugurated a further stage in the naturalization of perspective. Across the 20th century, from Lev Kuleshov's notion of perceptual experience as films without film, through Pierpaolo Pasolini's definition of film as the written language of reality, to Hollis Frampton's idea of reality itself as an infinite film, the prevailing imaginary of the world was submitted to the organizing principles of montage. Reality, by default equated with the real, became viewed not only as intrinsically perspectival, but as inherently cinematic. But as much as cinema innovated, it also continued the history of the camera, the history of photographic representations. Today, the photographic image of the world remains the standard against which all computer representations are measured. The holy grail of computer modeling software today is photorealism. For example, a great deal of coding ingenuity has gone into reproducing such imperfections as chromatic and spherical aberration that are an unavoidable characteristic of glass lenses, but which have to be programmed into otherwise optically perfect virtual lenses. In the long history of perspective, what I've described as industrial photography, by which I mean that which originated in the Industrial Revolution and led to the lumps of metal around our neck with camera and Canon and Nikon stamped on them. Industrial photography has not been superseded in the transition to digital photography. Photography has permanently imprinted our imaginary and our image environment, to the extent that the highest ambition of computer simulation today is to show the world not as it appears in reality, but as it appears when photographed. Thanks.